Hello, this is Adrian Gonzalez, President of Adelante, and welcome to today's MindPick Session. MindPick Sessions are an opportunity for Adelante members to pick the minds of leading academics, authors, business leaders, and other executives, not only around supply chain logistics topics, but as well as leadership and management topics as well. We are privileged today to have Terri Griffith with us today. She is the professor of management at Santa Clara University, and she's also the author of the recently published Plugged-In Manager, which I have read 80% of it so far, and it's been a fantastic read. So welcome, Terri.
Thank you, Adrian. Nice to be with you today.
And, Terri, you and I were able to spend some time together last month at the CSCMP conference where we did a session on social media in supply chain management. And obviously after kind of the great reception we got there, definitely wanted to invite you today and kind of explore some of the topics that we touched upon in that session and really focus a little bit more on the book itself, which was just published last month. So as a way of starting out, why don't you give us a quick overview and background on your role there at the university, your research focus, your experience, just to give everyone a little bit of a context in terms of where you're coming from and what your areas of focus are.
All right, thanks. I'm a professor in the business school, Levy School of Management, here at Santa Clara University. And Santa Clara University is located in the heart of the Silicon Valley. So I have wonderful access to both the startup community and the more established organizations like Cisco, and I get to keep a pretty close tab on how they're using different kinds of technologies, both social technologies and more focused on workflow. So that was actually why I moved back to California, was to be able to be in that kind of rich environment. I started out looking at scientists and engineers and how they got their work done. And I worked for Hughes Aircraft for a long year. It was a very long year, looking at how we could change the workflow process for the work around the M1 tank and the Bradley fighting vehicle. And after a fairly successful, now that I think about it, a fairly successful project, I went on to Carnegie Mellon because it was a place known for integrating how people think about the organizational process of work and how they think about technologies, everything from steel mills to computer information systems. And that really is what's given me the background to pay very close attention both to the organizational side of things and the information technology and hard technologies along the way. So, I usually claim that I've been doing this since 1984 or 1983, and it's a beautiful time. I mean, you can imagine that in the mid-'80s, when we were looking at things like virtual work, there was a lot of pushback. And when we were looking at things that would be tracking work, there was a lot of pushback. And now we have systems where people check in to share with their teams about the work they're doing every single day. And they're doing that, voluntarily on their own because they want to be engaged with those team members that now do tend to be not sitting right in the cube next to them. So this is an exciting time for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think obviously, I started my career at Motorola back in the early 90s, and just seeing, the change over the past, 20 or so years, and how, I used to get my, job done back then, and how companies are working today in a relatively short time period has been really, transformational. So let's get to the book right now. And, I'll start with the most basic question, right? I mean, the title is The Plugged-In Manager. What is a plugged-in manager? And why did you write this book? What was the driving force for you to kind of put your ideas together and your research together around this topic? And why now?
Right. A plugged-in manager is actually a very rare creature. It's someone who, as a matter of course, very naturally, will look at an organizational situation and use all of his or her resources. So I think most of us tend to gravitate to one of our people, our technology, or our organizational process expertise, and not pay so much attention to whatever the other two might be. Plugged-in managers don't do that. Plugged-in managers make full use of all three of those resources, and it's almost as if they're looking at I think about an equalizer board for stereos, and they're moving those levers up and down so that they keep a beautiful mix of whatever the work is that they're trying to get done. So they're very focused on the work, but they look at the work and they say, who are the people that I either have or could get? What are the technology tools that I either have or could get? And what's the organizational process, and will I need to make adjustments, either small ones or big ones, to make this whole system work? And, I want to give full credit to the folks in the 1950s who really laid this out for us in the beginning. They were looking at coal mines and how the teams of coal workers would then work with different kinds of equipment, because the equipment was changing fairly rapidly, and how they could let them self-organize around getting the work done in the safest way possible. And it was an instance where, management at the time didn't really think about human capabilities, and they didn't really think about variability in organizational practice. They tended to be very technology focused. And frankly, we haven't much changed in the last, 60 years. It's easy to focus on a technology tool. It's easy to price a technology tool. And yet technology tools are just one piece of this broader system of the people, the technology, and the organizational practice. So that's what a plugged-in manager is. Now, what got me to spend, a little over 2 years putting together all these stories is I'm the kind of person for whom it just pains me when I run into scenarios where things aren't plugged in. And at the same time, it's the best part of my day if I uncover a system that is plugged in. And, my two favorite examples at the moment are, if we think about the iPhone, plugged-in managers understand why the iPhone is a beautiful thing. It has a back office system of negotiations that get us access to both apps and information. It has a beautiful user interface. It has nice industrial design. But those things are wrapped up into a system that includes iTunes and everything behind it. The phone on its own really doesn't give us much. But you combine the phone with people who are wanting to stay more connected with the organizational practices that support iTunes and everything else, and you've got a glorious system. And then the last time I was talking about this, I'd just gotten off a plane, and that means I had just gone through a TSA checkpoint. That's not plugged in. So plugged-in managers look at the TSA checkpoint, and they say, why? Why are we, the people, being forced to go through all these gyrations and humiliation, often, to maintain security? There must be a more plugged-in approach where we could maintain the level of security, still use the grand technologies that they have, but make the system work together better. But again, what I find is that's a relatively rare capability unless you're sitting in a group. I was at a conference last weekend where everyone I talked to had that in their language. They never would just talk about technology features, but they would always talk about how those features played in with the work and the things that the people were looking for.
Well, let me play kind of devil's advocate a little bit here, Terri. When I first got the book and I looked at the the subtitle, which is get in tune with your people, technology, and organization to thrive. This whole people, process, technology. Now, of course, I've been in the analyst industry for 12 plus years, and people, process, technology is something that analysts, it's kind of analyst speak and consultant speak, and it's something that's been talked about, for a long time. It's almost become kind of cliched. So my initial impression was, before I even started reading the book, was okay. She's going to be talking about how it's important to integrate people, process, and technology. I get it, but what's new about that? And I think you do a nice job of kind of recognizing that yes, that's always been true, but there's a difference today, right? So what is different today than it was? When people talk about people, process, technology, when you talk about people, process, technology. What's different today than it was, let's say, 10 years ago,
right.
and why?
I'll answer that in two ways. The first is to push back a little bit, because yes, the analysts get it, and yes, people at Forrester and Gartner and people in my field, we get it. But again, if I go out into the broad organization and I ask companies to show me a change plan, they'll show me a change plan where they put in money for the technology tools. And I'll say, okay, but you just told me people is really important to this change process. Where's that money? Where's the training budget? Where's the scrap budget? Where's all this? And they'll go, oh, well, that'll just work itself out. And, I then look at them and I smile and I ask them, well, how generally do your changes work out? What's your hit rate? And, if they're being honest, they'll tell me the hit rate that's been the case for decades, which is 50 to 60% are successful. 50 to 60% of our organizational changes, with whatever focus they have, be they people, technology, or practice, though that means 40 at least are failing. And I think they're failing because we understand it at a framework level. I'm not sure we practice it on a day-to-day level to the extent that we would all hope. So if we as analysts are doing an assessment, we're certainly going to hit those 3 points. But I think in practice, for whatever reason, and we've written a paper that looks at accounting, actually maybe one of the reasons that technology gets all the focus, because you can price it. And they have a very hard time pricing the rest of it,
right.
And so it just sort of gets pushed to the side. Talked with an organization yesterday, and they were saying, well, the last 3 times we brought in a new capability, we in the recommendation set fully had, staffing and training time, and by the time the budget was done, the answer was no. And that was everything from IT to building facilities tools. And, as a result, a lot of these things don't end up working well. So that's been the case. So I would say, we may get to travel in a rarefied level of people who understand this, but when push comes to shove in the organization,
right.
It may not play out as often as we would like. But definitely things are different now. And the way I think about that one is 9-year-olds have cell phones. Are 9-year-olds thinking about the use of that technology in particular organizational contexts and what the benefits might or might not be? And if we have to start thinking about how technology integrates with our life and our work from the time we're 9 moving forward, that's different than it was in the past. So people are bringing their own tools into the organization, but how are they, who aren't trained necessarily in systems design, how are they making those choices about the best tools and the best practices for their particular work setting? And that's a whole new world. Those people don't have that kind of analytic training. They don't have the systems design training. We all have to practice systems design now, but it's certainly not something that's covered in most schools.
Right. Well, let's take it a step further now. Get a little bit deeper. I mean, in the book, you kind of give 3 practices. To be a plugged-in manager, getting to be to provide that framework. The first one is stop, look, and listen. Then you talk about mixing. And then you talk about sharing. Okay. Why don't we start with? Let's start with stop, looking, listen. Quick synopsis or snapshot of what you mean by stop, look, and listen, and why is it important?
All right. So just like we teach kids, and this is apparently true around the world, before you step out into a street, you want to stop, you want to look, and you want to listen to make sure you're not going to get hit by the oncoming vehicle. And that's a little bit different than some technology implementations where we see the new device and we buy it. And then we think about how we might use it, so that the use case sometimes comes after the purchase. And so what I'm saying to folks is just take a moment of reflection to step back and say, who are these folks that you're going to be asking to do something different? What are the variety of technologies that they might have at play, and what kind of a setting are they going to have to integrate it into? And so do that stop and look, and then the minute you start to make those changes, be listening for feedback, because that's going to tell you if your initial assessment.
No, I get the sense when I kind of was looking at that, I think, just based on my own, experience in my career, that, many companies probably excel at or do a good job at the stop and look aspect of it. Being able to define, what's the current state of the market, what's our to-be direction, what are competitors doing, what's happening with our customers, et cetera, et cetera. And my sense is that the weakest link of those three, stop, look, and listen, is the listen, aspect. I think, having that kind of feedback, mechanism and bringing that back into the process, I think is where a lot of companies fall short. Do you agree with that? Is that what you see as well? And I know one of the things in the book you talked about, you highlight, is after-action reviews and the role that those play, and how perhaps social media can even link into that role. So what do you think about the listen phase? Do you agree with me that that's perhaps, in your experience, what you've seen, the weakest link? And, how can companies improve on that aspect?
I think they're all weak links, but I think you are right that it's the weakest of the link. And, I've studied change management broadly for a very long time. And we'll go into an organization and we'll say, okay, how's the change going? And they'll say, well, we adopted the issue and now we're in place. Well, what are you tracking? Tracking? What do you mean? And they won't have a systematic approach for how's that change going. And, I'll generally in class show a curve that, shows a drop off in performance when you try and do something new, due to the learning curve. But the question is, when do you expect that drop off to hit its inflection and come back up again? And if you're not tracking, how do you know if you're on a downward slide or you're right on target, you're similar to what other companies have seen, and you're just about to make that move? So I don't see people on their own, without a lot of effort being put in place, implementing feedback systems or listening systems. And yet that may become so much easier that we will see it. If you think about the social analytics, like you mentioned, or even big data, our movements, our work, our process is tracked automatically in so many cases today that even if I didn't set myself up to be tracking my implementation across time, I can go back and actually collect that data now and take a look at it. And the fact that it's so much easier now may mean that people will start to do it a little bit more. And the tools almost beg for us to do it. Everybody likes to see how many followers, how many hits, how many whatevers. We have this, badge mentality that may become something that's a real big benefit.
Right. I mean, I think that's certainly the power of, social media technologies, whether they're the kind of the public sites or internal enterprise social technologies, where you can get this feedback, and you can have listening processes much more real time, perhaps, than you could in the past, to help in terms of making those fine-tuned adjustments to, the strategy you put in place, or your level of service, or whatever the case might be.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's an interesting evolution. If we think about how even dimensional quality in production processes used to have to be measured by, tool makers sampling off the production line and measuring with micrometers, and we went from that to laser measuring systems that might kit each of the products to check their dimensional quality, now to something that completely tracks the entire production process. It's a great evolution to get to see.
Right, great. Let's talk about the second practice, which summed up in one word is mixing, which is really bringing together, the people, process, technology, and the organizational aspect of it. Right. You make a distinction in the book, in terms of mixing versus weaving, which I thought was really interesting. The other thing that you talk about is providing a framework to how do you do. You talked early on in the intro in terms of moving different levers, right? And so how exactly can companies do this mixing? And is there a framework for them to do this? And you talk in the book about negotiation kind of being a good framework for mixing. Why so? Why is negotiation and kind of the tools and the framework around, what a good negotiation process is, a good framework for the mixing side of things? And maybe define mixing real quick as well, if I defined it.
Well, I'll define mixing a little bit out of context, and this, I always give credit to this friend of mine who writes a bunch of cookbooks. If you think about an image of all the ingredients it takes to make a chocolate chip cookie, you've got the flour, the eggs, the chocolate, all sort of sitting there. That's not a chocolate chip cookie, right? Those independent components are not good. So it takes skilled mixing, knowing the order, knowing the methodology to put those things together in a way that's going to turn out to be something that's going to make us all happy in the afternoon. We don't have recipes, though, in terms of this kind of mixing. We don't have recipes because all of our organizations are slightly different. The people we're working with, the tools we have access to, they're too different for me to ever sit down and say, this is the right approach for you. And given that that's true, negotiation is a skill that most people in organizations are at least familiar with, if not expert in. And if we think about these as negotiations, it also means they're social, which means I'm not trying to do it all in my own head, because it's really unlikely that I'm going to be the best expert we have across all three of those dimensions.
Right.
And so if I think about it as a negotiation, it's going to mean I have to think about each of my stakeholders. I have to think about the different dimensions and, the issues that are on the table. So, which technology are we going to use? Is it going to be, a kiosk computer? Is it going to be a laptop that's been hardened? Is it going to be an iPad? Those are three different outcomes that are on the table to be negotiated. What are we going to ask people to be contributing via that tool? I'm thinking of a particular example of a company called Industrial Molds in the Midwest, where they really didn't feel that the shop floor, people who were actually doing the work of the company, was at all connected to the people in the air-conditioned offices. And it wasn't going to be the case, because it hadn't been for decades, that the people would be moving back and forth from the air-conditioned spaces back down to the shop floor. That transformation just didn't happen. And they thought, well, what if we use social technologies to kind of let the shop floor know when different orders were coming in, what the bid processes were looking like, were there other issues that the folks in the air conditioning should be thinking about? And so they started to see how there could be great value. And, the end of the story is there was great value to them, but they actually thought about it as a negotiation. Well, if we use this, what's the trade-off going to have to be that'll make this other party, also find value? So it keeps, basically good change process in mind. So we know who the stakeholders are. We brainstorm about all the different issues and what the different outcomes could be. And then what everybody's going to get once the give and take is done is going to make this thing work for the organization. And that just seems to be one that's easier than me trying to teach people a whole new method. Let them use a method they already know.
Yeah, I think you do a nice job in the book. I think, with some of the examples you give, I think my takeaway was looking at this from a negotiation standpoint and kind of the templates, the example templates you put in the book. It really showcases how, you've got the technology considerations, the people considerations, and the organizational considerations, and they all come into play through the process of going through this kind of negotiation framework or thought process as you're going through some of these decisions, which I thought was nice. Let me get to the third practice, which is the one that I found most interesting because it really ties into what we're trying to do here at Adelante, which is sharing. And of course, what we're trying to do here is we're bringing, I would say it's more external sharing, right? Because we're bringing together executives from different industries, different companies, and the main value proposition is for our members to share knowledge, advice, best practices with one another. But you always get the questions around, well, how much do you share, right? What do you share? What is, concerns around confidentiality, things of that nature. So Talk a little bit about sharing. How do you enable it? Where do you draw the lines? Internal sharing, with your colleagues and your internal groups versus external sharing in terms of what you share with, other peers in the industry, perhaps, or your partners or your suppliers, customers. What's the sharing aspect all about?
All right. Sharing has two levels to me in terms of sharing around the practices of being plugged in, and then sharing in terms of the kind of social sharing that I think we can also talk about. So sharing the practices of being plugged in, I think, has value because as more people in your organizational setting come to understand that this is a valuable approach, the approach then becomes easier. If I say to people, I am going to want to engage with you, I am going to want to negotiate with you as we think about how to adjust this work, and they don't say, well, why are you doing that? What's in it for me? Instead, they know what's in it for them, and they know that this is going to be a better approach. Then you're just not having to kind of continue to push a rock uphill in terms of bringing everybody along with you. So there's that form of sharing. And I think the mechanism that works best there is, thinking aloud. Well, why are we sitting down today to think about this as a negotiation? What's the value in it for all of us if we do that? And keeping that very explicit as we move along. So there's kind of this training element to the sharing. Sharing on the other side, I agree. It's the deep security question that so many organizations have about collaboration and communication, and then what are the risks of that collaboration and communication. And the organizations that seem to succeed are those that deal with the issues really explicitly, that make it abundantly clear what information is supposed to be kept private in the particular work group, what information is private to the organization, and then what information then is public to the world. A training video around a company product, and to use an example, they put up false company data. They knew they couldn't report real company financial data because this was a publicly traded firm, and so they used false data. But they didn't think about the fact that because it was coming across their network, people were going to see that data and really not have any way of knowing that it was fictitious. And so they were asked to bring the video down. And I thought, yeah, that would have caught me too. I wouldn't have thought of that one.
The other thing that's part of this, it was part of your chapter on sharing, which I thought was interesting, and this came up actually at the CSCMP conference last month with someone who raised a question. You talk about, I forget who you quote in the book, but it was this whole area of focus on the work, not on the kind of terminology. You can get so caught up on blogs and wikis and friending and all these terminology, Enterprise 2.0, all these buzzwords that are out there. And I think the question that we got at the conference last month, someone said, look, I already have, tons of emails I have to respond to. I already have meetings I have to participate in. I've got, documents I have to review, et cetera, et cetera. For me to, start plugging in, if you will, to some of these other social media feeds like, Twitter, they just view that as just more information overload and more work for them. So how... I think what you spelled out nicely in the book was really to kind of take that step back and really think out loud, if you will, like you were mentioning before, about, well, the goal really is not to add more work, right? The goal is to kind of think out loud in terms of how we can, think through the whole thing about stop, book, and listen and integrating the three. Here's a technology opportunity. Where does it make sense? How can we change perhaps our processes, and what do we need to do as people to bring it all together to kind of create value and move forward?
That's right. And, I'll give credit to Stuart Nader, who wrote the book Wiki Practices, for that one. I was interviewing him because I was interested in all the work he does, helping organizations move to more social and collaborative processes. And I said, well, you must have to explain this to folks every day. How do you do it? And he goes, well, I don't. I go, what do you mean you don't explain it? He goes, those words, don't help me. But if I say, how do you get your work done now? How would you like to get your work done? oh, well, what if we use this approach that happens to have this technology attached to it? Would that simplify your life, make your work more efficient, make your work more effective? And I went, oh, so it was like one of those light bulb moments where, focus on the work is really the key. And, being able to demonstrate, in simple settings even, where changing that work can be improved.
Yeah, no, good point. So let's, in the book, you kind of highlight different scenarios and different kind of assessment of, whether you're how do you know whether you're a plugged-in manager or not? So what is, obviously in the book you go into much more detail, you give much, templates and some scenarios there, but, can you give just a couple of quick examples perhaps? You're a plugged-in manager if, or you're probably not a plugged-in manager if you do this.
Okay.
Some thoughts on
There's
that.
a couple clear ways. So I would say somebody should know that they personally are plugged in if people in their organization come to them saying, I heard about this technology, I heard about this new practice, how would we actually use that? And they look to that individual, if they look to you for how to help them kind of walk through how it might be effective or not in the organization, that's the best signal I've got. If you have outside people coming to you for advice, big trigger, right? Big trigger.
And I think there it becomes, this is kind of this sharing, if you will, because people are obviously looking at you and recognizing certain attributes about you, and the way you're communicating, the way you're collaborating, etc., that sends that signal to them to say, this person is quote unquote plugged in.
You could even think about, the IT people in your organization. They vary along the plugged in scale as much as, any of the rest of us do. And I bet in your company, many of us sit back and go, well, if I've got a question about help, I'm going to go to this person because they're not going to talk jargon to me. They're going to understand my work practice. I'm going to get the best advice from that person versus someone who might do a feature dump on you about, today's latest technology. And so you could probably, if you think you aren't plugged in, you probably could sit back and without much work, find people that you think are plugged in and start to watch their capabilities and how they go about, making adjustments in the work. The other way to do it, and this is how I track down most of my examples, is I'm reading blog posts, magazine articles, things I see on TV. And if there's a consistent discussion of all three dimensions of the people, the tool, and the process, then that's somebody I want to talk to. Or if there's an explicit point of, and I would never just look at the technology, then I know that's somebody I want to talk to. And the thing that's kind of nice for me is those are also people who want to share, right? Because they're plugged in managers. And so it's not that hard and not that uncommon for me to see that somebody's at a global conference, see what they're writing about, send them a quick, tweet or something, and be able to then interview that person in the next couple of days. And I have benefited greatly from the fact that plugged in managers want to share about that capability, and they tend to be fairly explicit about the approach that they're using in their writing or speaking. So just having your eyes open, having that set of glasses on is a great tool.
Kind of related to that, and something I hear from, executives that I talk to is to say, Adrian, this whole topic of plugged in or social media, I can see that, and you highlight some of these companies in your book, I can see that being applicable if you worked at Apple or Google or Amazon or any kind of, consumer-oriented company. But you know what? I work at a paper company or, a steel company or some, we've been around for 100 years. Things are moving very slow here. We're kind of an old economy, type of company. What does it mean to be plugged in our industry? And is it even that important? Your thoughts on that?
I'll mention again this company, Industrial Molds, how old school is that? That they've got, air conditioned offices, and then they've got the shop floor, and there's little communication between the two. And yet, after thinking it through and working through some different attempts, now they've got a communication flow that is hugely helpful. So the people who are sending out contracts aren't making bids that the shop floor is not going to be able to fulfill. The shop floor is hearing from their friends about a new technique and passing that up in a way that can impact the bidding process. So that's one small company example. Nucor Steel is another one I constantly go back to, because they're not so much talking about communication and collaboration via technology, but it's communication and collaboration around heavy melted steel, very risky environments, and yet they're completely focused on safety and customer value. But they do it through a heavier emphasis on the organizational process. So they've only got 4 layers of management, huge focus on personal accountability and accountability to a team. The organizational systems are aligned, but very aware of the needs of the heavy machinery that they're working with. And, if something's not working out, they either change the machinery, or they change the process, or they change the knowledge set that they have, but they're constantly thinking about it that way, in a very aligned way. So it doesn't have to be about fancy social media. It can be about old school, hard manufacturing processes, but are those aligned with the people that they have access to and the organizational processes that they follow?
Great points. Before I get to the last question, a lot of these questions were really kind of a merging together of several questions that we got from our members. But I want to read one specific one from one of our members, because it was a little bit, I couldn't weave it into the rest here. So let me just read it. After reading chapter 1 of the book, I reflected on how our organization embraces or doesn't embrace the effectiveness of a plugged-in manager. We encourage the use of technology by our customers, but don't make good use of it internally. A big deterrent, in my opinion, for our organization is security. We are likely to, in the customer service scenario, which is one of the scenarios that you highlighted at the opening of the book, they're more than likely to ask a service rep that's doing some creative things around using social media for customer service to stop that activity until they've had a chance to clear it with company security and marketing. So personally, I suggest that we press forward, but inevitably these sorts of things seem to get hung up in bureaucracy. Are there simple concepts that would offset the concerns with security, from a personal security to inventory asset security to proprietary process security? So this whole area of security as it relates to all this.
That's a very sophisticated and realistic question. And what I think I try and do, and I'm fairly sure I mentioned it in the book, is the IT security folks should actually be your friend, not your foe. And the better relationship you have with those people, the less of a surprise it's going to be to them when you come and say, hey, could you quit blocking this site? Could you help me out here? We really see an opportunity to engage with our customers, but they can't get to us because you've blocked whatever tool that you're looking at. If you kind of show up unannounced and surprise them, their initial response is almost certainly going to be, no, we can't do it. We got to really do a full analysis of this. But if you start that process early and stay in constant touch with them, just as part of your team, then you won't have those startup costs, right, and the initial pushback. But instead it'll be, okay, well, maybe we could do this first and then we could do this second. It'll be more of a negotiation rather than a battle with them. And
right. That's what I was going to say. It seems like it's a nice tie-in with stop, look, and listen. Stop, looking at the opportunities or how we're currently doing things, what could we be doing better, etc., and then engaging in that negotiation, including the security people as part of that.
And I'll admit it, I'm fairly free with how I share copies of the book in my own organization because I want them already thinking these ways before we're confronted with some question where they're going to have to tell me yes or no.
Right. So last question, right? So, we've obviously want to encourage everyone to kind of that's attending today to read the book, because I think there's a lot of great information. I think that as you read the book and read some of the concepts here, you'll all get some, you'll all probably have additional questions, and at a minimum, we can start engaging in conversation around some of the things you talk about in the book. But what recommendations would you give to people listening in today in terms of they've heard some of the key concepts here, they're interested in this topic in terms of how to be a more plugged-in manager. So after they kind of shut down their computer and get back to work, over the next few days, what are some steps that they should take, some starting points for them?
Mm-hmm. So the next time you're going to coffee, the next time you're going to lunch, the next time you're going out for that after work beverage, ask your colleagues, what piece of our work could we do better? What's a frustration that you have right now, or what's a dream that you've seen some other organization be able to, grab hold of, but in our organization we haven't done it. Again, start with the work and start with something that's an irritant to as many people as you can possibly find, because then your group of stakeholders that are going to support you will be broader. And, we all have things in our work, or at least everybody I know does. We all have things in our work that are frustrations. So go to that frustration and say, how could we do this part better? And try and figure out who those stakeholders are going to be. And they may be in places you wouldn't have thought. Reaching out to that IT security person early, or reaching out to somebody on the shop floor, reaching out to the person next door that you never actually talked to, and tying those ideas together. So that's a little bit of stop, look, listen. I could probably say it's stop, look, drink some coffee, and listen. But do that and have it be a social process as much as anything else. But we all want our organizations to work better. We've got tools coming at us so quickly these days. There's probably some room for improvement. So that's my story. Go drink some coffee with your colleagues.
Great words of advice. And with that, we're out of time. But really, the purpose of these MindPick sessions is really to get a conversation started. So we're going to be initiating a discussion forum around today's MindPick session. So it's an opportunity for all of our members to, particularly if you weren't able to make it today's session live, to listen to the recording and be able to post your reactions, your additional questions, and get the community to continue, discussing these ideas. And so we'll invite Terri to participate as well as time permits, to be able to contribute to the conversation on an ongoing fashion. So again, Terri, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and certainly look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone.
Adrian, that kind of froze on me just there, but I will say thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you about these issues and to share the ideas of plugged-in management, and I look forward to sharing online.